Hey, so in this episode, I'm going to be briefly talking about Tarkintowns and Hoovervilles. Eventually, when I was planning this episode, I thought this was an original idea of mine. I felt pretty swell about it, but then I looked it up and other people have thought of this shit. And so I started thinking about it and I thought, well, my idea was kind of dumb. And actually, this was originally modeled on this idea. So Hoovervilles are Great Depression shanty towns, pretty much. There's more to it, but essentially poverty-stricken people, especially homeless communities that were brought on by the Great Depression because of Hoover and his sort of incompetence. They're named after Hoover. I started planning this grandiose script and all this stuff, but I feel like it would actually be better to just talk briefly about some of the differences and similarities between Tarkintowns and Hoovervilles. But mainly, I also want to propose an argument that if we're just talking about American history, there's some other parallels. The main one I'm going to talk about is just reservations, particularly those in the Jackson administration. And also, if we're going to be real about it, if you're talking Sith Lord, Hoover is less of a Sith Lord, and damn Jackson is more of a Sith Lord. That dude nearly got assassinated more than once. And one time they had to peel him off somebody else. He was 80-something, beating the crap out of other people. My point is that, Jackson is a real scary human, and, Hoover, not nearly as much. So, Tarkintown, I think, is actually a closer parallel to, reservations. And also the American idea of, taking, Native Americans and being hey, guess what? You get to live in, this small square-acre plot in the middle of uncharted land that we can't really use right now. That's a lot more what happens in Lothal. The farming communities are pretty much forced to live off the land permanently by obviously an external political group like the Empire. They're consolidating them and using their previously owned land for their own purposes, particularly to fund their war effort, which ultimately is what happens in the reservations. Now the Hoovervilles is more economic, and it was more the communities were actually naming these after the president. I think that a major difference that I'm going to cite is Tarkintowns are named after not Palpatine, the guy at the top, but somebody who sort of forced this to happen, who's not at the top. He's just the top of that problem. So it's a little bit more narrow, and it's more Star Wars specific canon knowledge than anything else. The Oklahoma reservations, on the other hand, and because I'm saying the Oklahoma ones because there's a lot of reservations across the United States. The Oklahoma reservation was it wasn't the first one, but it was one of the most famous because of the Trail of Tears, because of these pretty massive migration routes that forced Native American communities and indigenous populations to march through the southern states. So this isn't just Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, that area, but it's mainly those areas. And these peoples were forced into communities of whoever survived by a growing political unit that lived in similar proximity in order so that they could fund their own war effort and help their population thrive. Again, very similar to what's happening in Tarkintowns. In my mind, the key differences between a Tarkintown and the reservation model are obviously that fictional and real, but just self-evident. I mean, duh. But the space difference, because Tarkintowns are on one planet. Presumably there's more than one Tarkintown. There's only the one that we know about in Lothal from the Star Wars Rebels TV show. But these communities are presumably consolidated from a planet-wide distance, whereas reservations say in Oklahoma house Native Americans from the middle and southern regions of the U.S. and included forced marches to get there. Presumably, again, you'd be sort of enslaved or thrown in the back of a transport and taken there by the Empire. So it's different because Trail of Tears was a forced march. You're not going to force across. It would take too long to march across an entire planet. So it's just kind of technological difference. Another difference that could be cited is that Tarkintown was named after Tarkin, who's a big sort of political figure, military figure, whereas the reservations were not. Although it's important to note that this could be the case because Native American voices were systematically wiped from the earth in huge heaps, and also that Americans at the time were not interested in what Native Americans were talking about. They were actually trying to remove Native American cultures from the face of the earth. So if they were calling it, say, Jacksonville or Jacksontown or Jackson City or whatever, people around there would not have listened to them or cared, and they could have been shot. And so their voices were not preserved. So I'm not saying this is hard evidence for that, but it could be that they were making fun in a similar way and it was not preserved. Another sense that could shed some light on this is that the name reservation kind of is like a definite euphemism. It's a way of like saying really nicely that like America's not imperialist. We're just like helping preserve, or like we're reserving this space for these people. And it's like, oh, okay, but like all of America used to be reserved for them. So what you're saying is like your own land is not reserved, but we left you a little portion. So that demonstrates that like they're trying to sugarcoat the ugly reality that exists between an imperialist state emerging and subjugating native and local peoples to expand for its own sake. A final point that the main bulk of the episode is done at this point, but like a bonus point is that Tarkintown was destroyed because Darth Vader felt like torching it, destroying it. So Agent Callus, the ISB officer, like executed this plan. A potential factor could exist. It's kind of reaching, but like the physical destruction of Tarkintown could in some sense relate to the spiritual, cultural, and financial ruin of indigenous communities in America. Obviously this is reaching, but I think reservations aren't really destroyed after they're created, so it doesn't make a lot of sense in organizing the manpower required to relocate so many indigenous communities in the first place. But this could be sort of a political statement that these communities were already devastated and destroyed by the time they were consolidated into these reservations, and so in this sense they were already destroyed all but physically. So maybe that's a pretty weak argument, but I don't know if you agree with any of these things or you have something to add, or if you agree, that Tarkintowns are closer to Hoovervilles. That's what they were sort of based on in the first place, loosely. Then, comment that below, or feel free to watch another Star Wars video if this didn't jog your brain. But anyway, thanks for watching, and share it if you liked it. Thanks.